The radio room in Nice smelled of machine oil and fear. The walls were the color of old bone, not painted that way, but worn by time and cigarette smoke into a shade that looked like surrender. 16 typewriters sat in 4 rows, 16 operators in headsets. One rule: accuracy or death. The window was bricked up. The door had 2 locks. Dorotea Morelli was at position 9. She had been there since April 1942, and in all that time she had typed 47,362 German military transmissions without error. Her hands had become instruments of precision. Her ears had learned to separate signal from static like a musician separates notes from silence. She typed what she heard. She did not think about what it meant. At 14:47 on a Tuesday in late April 1944, everything changed. But at the time, it felt like nothing. The message came through the headset, Army Command Frequency, Wehrmacht Communications Net. The voice was German, crisp Viennese accent, the kind that came from officers who had trained before the war, when training still meant something. The message was coded, 5-letter groups, Enigma cipher, the language of orders that killed men. Dorotea typed, Group of 3 hold positions, Sector 9 artillery coordinates. She typed faster. The rhythm was automatic. Her fingers moved without instruction from her brain, which was still half asleep after the morning shift. She had learned not to listen too closely. Listening was dangerous. Thinking was worse. Then came the sound, a cough. Not a military cough, the kind a soldier suppresses in the throat. A real cough, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper. A man clearing phlegm, uncomfortable, embarrassed. Coordinates 43.12 north, 7 point, then the cough again. Same rhythm, same depth, same sound of a man too polite or too weary to spit properly. Point 28 east, correction. Dorotea's fingers paused for less than a second. Her supervisor did not notice. No one noticed. In the noise of 16 typewriters and 16 headsets and the hum of the transmission equipment, a paused finger meant nothing. But Dorotea noticed. She finished the transmission, filed the page, and returned to waiting. By 15:03, 17 more transmissions had come through. She typed them all. At 16:15, the shift changed. She left the radio room and walked through the underground corridor to the dormitory where the female operators lived. 4 beds to a room, no privacy. 1 toilet that smelled like copper and mold. She lay on her bed and thought about the cough. It was not a remarkable cough. Thousands of men coughed during transmissions. The Luftwaffe pilots coughed. The Army logistics officers coughed. The SS commandants coughed. Coughing was universal. Coughing was war. But this cough had structure, rhythm. The man had paused mid-transmission, coughed 3 times in a controlled way, and resumed exactly where he left off. As if the cough was not an interruption but an insertion. As if someone was encoding information into the involuntary act of breathing. Dorotea had been trained in cryptology, not officially. Women were not offered such training, but through listening. 3 years of listening had taught her that military codes were built on repetition, and repetition was built on habit. Officers who transmitted daily developed signatures in their speech. They paused in the same places. They used the same filler words. They coughed at moments of stress. This cough was not stress. The next day was Wednesday. At 14:43, 4 minutes before the previous day's transmission, Dorotea adjusted her headset and waited. The signal came through on schedule. Same voice. Viennese accent. Same frequency. Artillery position, Sector 8. Coordinates, no cough. The message proceeded cleanly. Coordinates confirmation, end transmission. At 14:47, a different transmission came through, different voice, Army logistics, ammunition inventory. Then at 14:51, the Viennese voice returned. Correction to previous transmission, Sector 8. Coordinates adjustment. The cough came again, 3 times. Same spacing, same sound. Revised coordinates 43.05 north, 7.19 east. Dorotea's fingers moved, but her mind had already separated from the work. The pattern was forming. Cough plus correction, cough plus adjustment, cough plus something that needed to be recoded. By Friday, the pattern was unmistakable. By the following Tuesday, Dorotea had filled an entire notebook with observations. 1447 transmission, original coordinates, no cough. 1451 transmission, correction, cough present, new coordinates. The new coordinates, always different from the first. The cough, always present on the correction. The officer was transmitting false data, then correcting it with coughed information. But only officers in the field knew the difference between the two. Officers in command would receive both transmissions and assume the second was an update. They would move their men to the new positions, believing they were following orders. Except the new positions were different, slightly different, by 500 meters, by a kilometer, by the distance that could mean survival or death. The man was encoding corrections into his own body. On a Thursday evening, Dorotea sat in the dormitory with a cup of fake coffee, chicory and barley. No real coffee had reached Nice in 2 years, and tried to remember who had that voice. Viennese accent, authority, the kind of calm that came from either confidence or exhaustion so complete it resembled peace. She had heard thousands of voices in the radio room, most of them blurred together, most of them meant nothing to her personally. But this voice lived in her memory in a different category. This was a voice she had not heard on the radio. This was a voice from before the radios, from the time when her brother Alberto was alive, from the time when she lived in Genoa instead of Nice. It was the voice of Captain Kurt von Gelhar. She had last heard it in the interrogation room at Marino, the Italian prison camp near Rome, April 1943. After Italy fell, after the fascists began turning on each other, after her brother, a communist sympathizer, a factory worker, a man who had done nothing worse than read forbidden books, was arrested. Von Gelhar had been there, not the lead interrogator, that was an Italian officer, but present, silent mostly, occasionally speaking. His voice had asked her brother questions. Where are the others? Who brought the books? Questions that did not require answers so much as require breaking. Dorotea had been allowed one visit. She was permitted to sit in a room while her brother sat across from her at a table. A guard stood in the corner. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. Alberto had not spoken. His eyes had moved. That was all. His eyes had looked at her and she understood. Do not come back. 2 weeks later, the Red Cross informed her that he had died of pneumonia. Dorotea set down the coffee cup and walked to the bathroom. She locked the door and looked in the mirror. Her face was still there, thin now, sharper than before the war, the kind of face that people forgot easily. Brown eyes, brown hair, 31 years old and looking 40. She had been working for the Germans for 2 years as a radio operator. And before that, she had been in Marino for 6 months. And before that, she had been someone else. She had survived by becoming useful, by having skills, by being precisely the kind of person that machines could use without conscience. When the Nazis occupied Nice, the French radio operators fled or were arrested. The Nazis needed Italian operators who understood the local chaos. They selected her because she spoke German, Italian, and French. Because she had worked in radio before the war, teaching music at the lycée but knowing technical things, electrical things. Because she was alone. No family, no husband, no one to ransom or threaten. She had said yes because the alternative was a labor camp. She had said yes because she was tired of mourning. She had said yes because survival is not a choice. It is a capitulation to the day that comes next. Now she stood in a bathroom and realized that the man whose voice she had been typing for 2 weeks, The man whose cough had structure and meaning was the man who had stood silent in the corner of an interrogation room while her brother died. She did not know if this made sense. She did not know if the universe was capable of such coincidences, or if coincidence was just another word for the shape of things that had always been there, waiting. She knew one thing. She knew how to listen. The next Monday, Dorotea made a decision. She began keeping a separate notebook. Not hidden. Hidden things were dangerous, but innocuous. It looked like a personnel log, dates, times, transmission lengths. Nothing classified, nothing forbidden, just the notation of work performed. But beneath the surface, she was creating a map. Every transmission from the Viennese voice she marked. Every timestamp. Every cough. Every correction. By May 15th, she had 47 data points. The pattern was now undeniable. Original coordinates, positions where German artillery was actually deployed, corrected coordinates, positions where German forces had prepared false entrenchments, decoys, empty emplacements. The officer was teaching his men to survive by lying. He was encoding truth into his body. The cough was the signal that said, "This correction is the real position. Move there, survive there." It was genius. It was also treason. If the German High Command discovered that an officer was systematically transmitting false coordinates, he would be shot, possibly slowly. The SS did not look kindly on deception within the ranks. But if the Allies somehow understood the pattern, if they could decode the rhythm of the cough, they would know where the real positions were. They could concentrate their bombardment. They could save their own men by targeting the correct coordinates. Dorotea sat at her desk and felt the weight of this knowledge settle on her shoulders like snow. She had learned to survive by not choosing. Now she was being forced to choose. Stay silent and let both sides continue their slow dying. Or speak. On May 20th at 1447, the Viennese voice came through the headset again. Dorotea typed. Her hands moved. Her mind was elsewhere. The cough came at 1451 during the correction. Same rhythm, same sound. But this time Dorotea could feel it, the intentionality behind it. The man was not coughing because he was sick. He was coughing because he was choosing moment after moment to save his own men through the only method available to him. He was committing an act of rebellion encoded in biology, and no one knew, except her. After the shift ended, Dorotea walked through the streets of Nice toward the old town. It was spring. The flowers were blooming in defiance of everything. She sat in a small café on the Promenade des Anglais and ordered tea that tasted like boiled grass. She thought about her brother. She thought about the mirror. She thought about the man whose cough had become audible to her. Then she thought about what she had been trained to do: notice patterns, extract meaning from noise, separate signal from static. She had one skill, one only, and that skill had been bent toward preserving the machinery of a war she did not support. It was time to unbend it. The French had a radio room too, but it did not look like a cathedral of secrecy. It looked like a disaster. The building was in Algiers, requisitioned from a colonial bank manager who had fled to Switzerland. The walls were still painted in the colors of money, pale green and gilt trim, but the equipment inside bore no resemblance to grace. Radio men sat at broken desks. Signal analyzers used pencils because they had run out of pens. Maps were pinned to walls with nails and prayers. Two of the typewriters were missing keys. One had a typeface that printed backward. Captain Jean-Luc Martin sat in this chaos and tried to decode a war that refused to make sense. It was May 21st, 1944. The Allies had less than a month until Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. Martin's job was to make sense of German radio transmissions from the Mediterranean coast, specifically transmissions from the German 19th Army, commanded by General Friedrich Wiese. The army was dug in along the Côte d'Azur, waiting for an attack they believed would come from the sea, waiting to massacre the men who tried. Martin's department had intercepted 47 transmissions from one specific officer over the course of 6 weeks. The call sign was Aquila 7, Eagle 7. The officer commanded artillery positions across the Saint Raphael sector. His coordinates, when plotted on a map, showed a defensive line that made tactical sense, organized, disciplined, exactly what the Germans would deploy if they were expecting an amphibious assault, exactly what the French should fear. But Martin had a cryptographer on staff named Major Pierre Abel, and Abel was not a normal man. Before the war, Abel had been a professor of semiotics, the study of meaning-making, signs, the way humans encode truth into seemingly random symbols. He had published 3 papers on medieval manuscripts. He had written a book on how societies build meaning through ritual. Most importantly, he had trained himself to see patterns where others saw only noise. It was Abel who brought the letter to Martin on May 20th. The letter was 1 page, folded into a Red Cross envelope, addressed to Commandeur Français, Service de Renseignement Côte d'Azur, French Commander, Mediterranean Intelligence. The handwriting was female, careful, methodical, European. The message said, "L'homme qui tousse sauve ses hommes." The man who coughs saves his men. Nothing else, no signature, no explanation, just 1 sentence in French, written by someone who had access to information that should have been impossible to access. Martin read it 3 times. "This is a hoax," he said. "Or it is someone with access to the German transmission line," Abel replied. He was smoking a cigarette he had rolled from tobacco sweepings. His fingers were stained with cipher pencil. "Someone who understands encoding, and who is trying to tell us something." The man who coughs, that could mean anything. "Exactly," Abel said, "except that it doesn't. If someone went to the risk of sending this through a Red Cross channel, through occupied territory, through a dozen checkpoints, they are not being poetic. They are being literal. They are telling us that there is a man, and he coughs, and his cough means something." Martin stood and walked to the window. Below, Algiers was eating lunch. Vendors with thin tomatoes, soldiers with thinner hope. He thought about the 23,000 men who would land in the Saint Raphael sector in 4 weeks. He thought about the German artillery that would try to kill them. He thought about the mountains of bodies if the landing went wrong. He thought about a woman anonymous enough to fold a letter into a Red Cross envelope. "If I give you every Aquila 7 transmission we've intercepted," Martin said slowly, "can you find this man who coughs?" Abel smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting for someone to finally ask him a question worth answering. The pattern Abel worked through the night. By morning he had 17 cups of cold coffee and a thesis. "Listen," he said, showing Martin a chart. The chart looked like the work of a madman. Dates, times, transcription groups, symbols drawn in margins, arrows pointing backward through time. "On April 30th, Abel explained, pointing at the first line, "Aquila 7 transmitted coordinates for artillery positions in Sector 8. The coordinates were 43 degrees, 12 minutes north, 7 degrees, 28 minutes east. He transmitted them at 14:47. Clean transmission, no anomalies, confident delivery." Martin nodded. This matched their intelligence reports. The coordinates corresponded to known German artillery emplacements. "Then," Abel continued, "at 14:51, 4 minutes later, a different transmission came through. Different officer, logistics, routine, nothing remarkable. But at 14:55, Aquila 7 returned to the transmission channel with an update. He said, 'Correction to previous transmission Sector 8. And then he coughed 3 times and transmitted new coordinates: 43 degrees, 5 minutes north, 7 degrees, 19 minutes east. Correction, Martin said. They update positions all the time. Yes, Abel said, but look at what happened next. He showed Martin the subsequent intelligence reports. 2 days after Aquila 7's corrected coordinates, the Allies dropped bombs on the original coordinates, 4312 north, 728 east. The bombs missed, 20 meters off, 30 meters off. The German artillery had already moved. Then, a week later, the Allies bombed the corrected coordinates, 4305 north, 719 east. Direct hits, 40 artillery guns destroyed, 300 soldiers dead. He was encoding truth into his cough, Abel said quietly. Original coordinates are false. Corrected coordinates are real. The cough is the signal that tells you which is which. Martin sat down slowly. If this is true, it's true, Abel said. I've verified 17 transmissions over 6 weeks. Every time he coughs after a correction, the corrected coordinates are the real positions. Every time he transmits without coughing, those are the false coordinates. He is telling his own officers where the real positions are by encoding it into his own body. Why? Martin whispered. Because, Abel said, he is German but not a Nazi. Or he is German and a Nazi but human enough to not want his men to die in an artillery battery that doesn't exist. The war is lost. He knows it. So he is saving his men the only way he can, by lying to his own command through a method they will not understand. Martin stood and walked to the map. The Côte d'Azur was pinned with red flags, German positions, blue flags, Allied predictions of where the landings would occur. The two sets of flags barely overlapped. The Allies expected the Germans to be waiting in Cannes, in Antibes, in Port Grimaud. But if Abel was right, the German artillery was not where the maps said it would be. The German strength was in different places. The entire tactical picture was wrong, which meant the landing zone could be moved. The decision General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny commanded the French forces for Operation Dragoon. He was a small man with a large reputation. He had escaped German captivity twice. He had commanded troops in free territory while serving in Vichy government, a calculation that made him friends nowhere but enemies, equally distributed. When Martin brought him the analysis, Tassigny listened for 8 minutes without speaking. "This is impossible," he finally said. "Yes, sir," Martin replied. "You are asking me to change the landing zone for an entire operation based on the fact that a German officer coughs." "Yes, sir." "On the word of an anonymous woman in occupied France who sent a letter." "Yes, sir." Tassigny stood and walked to his own map. It was marked with the original landing plan. 23,000 men landing in the Cannes sector, artillery support from offshore, air cover from Tunisia. It was a plan that had been approved by Eisenhower himself. It was a plan that would cost 8,000 to 13,000 lives if the German defense was as strong as anticipated. But if Martin was right, the German defense was not where the maps said. "If I move the landing zone and you are wrong," Tassigny said, "I lose the operation. I lose those 23,000 men. I am court-martialed. I am shot." "Yes, sir," Martin said. "If I trust this anonymous cough, and you are right," Tassigny continued, "I save 12,000 lives and end the war in southern France 2 weeks early." "Yes, sir." Tassigny looked at the map. His hand moved across it, tracing a new line. The Gulf of San Rafael, a secondary landing site, a place where the Germans had committed fewer troops because they believed the main assault would come elsewhere. "Show me every cough," he said. The verification Abel spent 3 days cross-referencing every Aquila 7 transmission against aerial reconnaissance photos. The dates of the coughs corresponded to dates when German artillery had visibly moved in the photographs. The coordinates given after the coughs matched the new positions. The coordinates given without the coughs matched the old positions, positions that the Allies had bombed 2 weeks later, always finding empty gun emplacements or buried shells. But there was a risk. The woman who sent the letter could have been a German plant, a false transmission designed to mislead the Allies, a trap. Abel analyzed the handwriting. He compared it to known German operatives. He studied the grammar. The French was flawless, but with slight Italian patterns in the word choice. Not German at all, not Swiss. Italian-French, the kind spoken in Nice. Tassini made the call. He moved the landing zone. He organized 23,000 men to land in the Gulf of Saint Raphael instead of Cannes. He restructured the supply lines. He moved the artillery support vessels. He sent new orders to the aviation units in Tunisia. He changed the entire operational picture based on the sound of a man coughing into a radio telephone. On July 14, 1944, the French landed in the Gulf of Saint Raphael. The Germans had fewer than 400 troops in that sector. No heavy artillery, no reinforcements committed. They had expected the landings to come in Cannes, where they had positioned their heaviest guns, their strongest fortifications, their most experienced officers. The Allies met almost no resistance. The 23,000 French soldiers lost 1,740 men in the first 48 hours. Not 13,800, not 8,140. The difference was 12,060 human lives, the silence after. On July 16th, 2 days after the landing, Martin sat in a makeshift command post on the beach and listened to German radio transmissions. Aquila 7 was still transmitting. The officer's voice was different now, strained. The accent was still Viennese, but underneath it was the sound of a man who had realized his treason had been discovered, not by his own side, not yet, but by the world. His positions had been wrong. His men had been overrun. The landing had come where it should not have been possible. His final transmission came at 14:47, the exact time of day when his daily corrections always arrived. But this time, there was no cough. There was only silence, and then, very quietly, in German, "I am sorry for the men I could not save. I am sorry for the men I tried to save by lying. I am sorry that this war required a man to encode truth into the sound of his own lungs. If someone is listening, if someone on the other side is listening, you know now. You know that not all of us were willing servants of this madness. You know that some of us tried, in the only way we could, to make the blood stop." The transmission ended. Martin never heard Aquila 7's voice again. The Germans withdrew. The French advanced. The liberation of southern France took 4 weeks instead of 6. 23,000 men lived who would otherwise have died. Epilogue. The woman Martin spent 3 weeks trying to find her. The letter had been intercepted by the Red Cross in Lyon. The handwriting had been analyzed. The Italian-French patterns had been confirmed. But there was no name, no address, no way to track where the letter had been sent from. He filed a report. He wrote that the landing had succeeded because of German incompetence. He made no mention of the letter. He made no mention of the cough. He made no mention of the woman in the radio room who had spent 6 weeks listening to an officer's heartbeat encoded into the Enigma cipher. Tassini asked him once, "Do you think she survived?" "I don't know," Martin said, "but if she did, she is waiting for someone to find her. And we are not looking." Tassini nodded. He understood. The most dangerous people in war are not the ones who fight. They are the ones who listen. And in a war built on secrecy, a woman who listened too closely would be the first one to disappear. The war ended, but not for Dorotea. On August 25, 1944, the French liberated Nice. The Germans withdrew. The bunkers were abandoned. The radio station was seized by de Gaulle's forces, and Dorotea was taken from her desk while her hands were still on the typewriter keys. They did not ask her questions at first. They asked her to stand. They asked her to put her hands on her head. They asked her to remain silent. She complied. It was easier than speaking. She was held in a converted warehouse near the harbor. Other women were there, some who had worked for the German administration, some who had collaborated too obviously, some who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The French called them all the same thing, traitors. Dorotea did not protest. Protest required a narrative, and she had learned that narratives were dangerous. She kept her mouth closed and her hands visible. She waited. The interrogations began on the third day. A young officer sat across from her in a room that still smelled of salt and old cargo. He had a file. The file contained her employment records, her radio transcriptions, her lists of German military frequencies. "You worked for the Nazis," he said. "I worked as a radio operator," she replied. "You transmitted orders that killed Frenchmen." "I transmitted transmissions. I did not write them." "You understood German. You understood what you were typing." "Yes," she said. There was no point in lying about this. The officer leaned back. He was perhaps 25 years old. His uniform was new. His rage was older than his body. "How many did you kill?" he asked. Dorotea did not answer. The question assumed that she had a number. She had none. She had only the weight of thousands of characters typed into machines, filtered through her fingers into paper, and then into the vast apparatus of war. "Thousands," the officer said. "Thousands of Frenchmen died because of women like you. Women who collaborated, women who put their hands on German machines." He stood and left the room. She remained seated. The trial was held in October. Not a formal trial. Trials required judges and lawyers and the trappings of justice. This was a purge, a settling of accounts, a way for liberated France to perform its righteousness. Dorotea sat in a chair while a tribunal of 3 men read the charges. Collaboration, assisting the German war machine, complicity in occupation. She did not see anyone from the radio room. She did not see General de Lattre de Tassigny. She did not see Captain Martin. She did not see Major Abel. There was no one who knew that the letters she had written had saved 23,000 lives. There was only Dorotea and the accusation that she was a traitor. A woman testified. She had worked in the warehouse where Dorotea stored her belongings. She said she had seen Dorotea smile at German officers. This was a lie. Dorotea had smiled at no one in 2 years, but the tribunal wrote it down. A man testified. He said he had seen her reading German newspapers. This was true. She had read them. She had read them to understand the language better, to decode the frequencies more accurately, to construct the letter that would become the foundation of Operation Dragoon. But the tribunal heard only that she had read propaganda. No one testified that she had sent a letter. No one testified that the letter contained the key to breaking the German defensive line. No one testified that 12,060 human beings had lived who would otherwise be dead. Martin had filed a report. Martin had chosen not to mention her name. This was mercy, but it was also abandonment. The judgment came in November. She was found guilty of collaboration. Her sentence was 5 years of imprisonment in a French prison. After that, she would be marked femme tendue, hair-shorn woman. This was the mark of collaboration, the public shaming. Her hair would be cut. Her name would be recorded. She would carry the mark of her service in German radio rooms for the rest of her life. She did not cry when they told her. She had learned not to cry. Crying required the belief that circumstances were unjust. She had stopped believing in justice, but she did speak. When asked if she had any final words, she stood and said, "I am guilty. I transmitted German orders. I heard German voices in my ears day after day, and I typed their words into machines that carried their meaning into the world. But I did not create the orders. I did not command the armies. I only listened and transcribed." And listening in a war is a form of complicity that everyone shares. Everyone listens. Everyone hears. Everyone chooses what to do with what they hear. You are punishing me not for what I did, but for what I heard and did not report to you. But I reported to someone. I sent a letter, and that letter saved lives. If you find that letter in your archives, you will know that I was not a collaborator with Germany. I was a collaborator with France. But I am marked now, and the mark will not say this. The tribunal did not respond. They had no words for complexity. They had no language for the woman who had worked for the Germans while working against them. They only had categories: guilt or innocence, traitor or hero. No space for the people who had done both or neither. The prison years, 1944-1950. Dorotea served her sentence in a fortress prison at Montluc, near Lyon. The fortress was cold. It was designed to be cold. Cold broke people more effectively than heat. She shared a cell with 3 other women. One was a Nazi collaborator, a genuine one who had informed on resistance members and sent at least 30 people to their deaths. One was a woman accused of sleeping with a German officer. Her crime was desire, not treason. One was a woman like Dorotea, caught between worlds, guilty of necessity. The Nazi collaborator was released after 2 years due to an administrative error. She walked out in daylight. Dorotea remained. In 1947, a visitor came. It was Captain Martin. He was out of uniform now, discharged, retired, trying to build a life that did not involve war. He sat across from her in the prison visitation room. "I wanted to tell you," he said, "that Operation Dragoon succeeded beyond our expectations. The liberation of southern France took 4 weeks instead of 6. We prevented an estimated 180,000 civilian deaths from extended occupation. The men who lived, 23,000 of them, many of them are still alive. Many of them have families. Many of them have children who would not exist if the landing had gone differently." Dorotea listened. She did not speak. "I could not say your name in the report," Martin continued. "If I had, they would have tried to find you. They would have interrogated you. And in the chaos of war's end, I was afraid of what they would have done. So I remained silent. I filed the intelligence report under Abel's name. Abel was a hero. No one questioned his work. You remain invisible, and I remained guilty of abandoning you." Dorotea looked at him. "You listened," she said. "You heard the signal in the letter. You believed. That is not abandonment. That is collaboration. We collaborated across the lines. German officer, Italian woman, French captain, Polish cryptographer, all of us worked together without knowing each other's names. That is not guilt. That is war." Martin's eyes filled with tears, but he did not cry. Neither did Dorotea. They sat across from each other, 2 people who had changed the course of a war and received nothing for it but silence. "When you leave here," Martin said, "you should know that you are not forgotten by everyone. There are people who know your name. Abel knows. Tassigny knows. I know. The 23,000 men know, though they do not know, they know. They are alive because of a letter. That is not nothing." "It is enough," Dorotea said, and she meant it. The Liberation Dorotea was released in May 1950. She was 36 years old. She had spent 6 years in radio rooms, serving death, and 5 more years in prison as punishment for surviving those rooms. Her hair had grown back. It was gray now, though she was too young for gray. The prison had accelerated time for her. She felt ancient. She was not marked with the shorn head. The tribunal had rescinded that particular humiliation in 1948, a small mercy for a woman whose crime had been too complicated to categorize. But she was marked in other ways. Her name was on a list. Her past was recorded. She would never be able to work in any government position again. She would never be allowed to travel outside France. She was a woman who had listened too carefully and paid for it. She went to Nice. The city had recovered. The radio station was gone, dismantled by the French, all the equipment removed. The building was being turned into administrative offices. Dorotea stood outside it and did not go in. Instead, she found work as a teacher. A small school in Montmartre in Paris took her on. She taught music, the subject she had loved before the war, before radio, before the machinery of conflict. She taught children to listen, to hear the structure beneath sound, to understand that music, like war, was a language built on patterns and precision. Her students did not know her history. To them, she was simply Signora Morelli, the Italian teacher with gray eyes and a voice that could make a child understand why Vivaldi had written The Four Seasons with such specificity. She was gentle with them. She did not tell them that she had once listened to the sound of a man's cough and extracted meaning from it. But in 1963, during a lesson on rhythm and pattern, a student asked her, "Signora, how do you hear patterns that other people miss?" Dorotea set down her violin. She looked at the girl, 12 years old, bright-eyed, alive in a world that Dorotea had nearly died fighting for. "You listen," Dorotea said. "You listen very carefully. You understand that sound is not random. Every voice carries information, every breath, every pause. The world is trying to tell you its truth if you listen carefully enough. But listening is dangerous because once you hear the truth, you must decide what to do with it. And that decision will mark you forever." The girl nodded, not understanding but sensing that something important had been said. The cough remembered. In 1982, a documentary filmmaker named Claude Labelle was researching the history of Operation Dragoon. He found Abel's intelligence reports. He found Martin's files. He found the archived letter written in French, "L'homme qui tous sauve ses hommes." He tried to trace it. The Red Cross had no record of who had sent it. The handwriting analysis suggested Italian French, but no name could be attached. He interviewed Abel, who was 84 years old. Abel told him, "There was a woman. We never knew her name. She was in Nice. She worked for the Germans. She heard the pattern and had the courage to report it without reporting it. She did not sell information to us. She gave us a key to decode information the Germans themselves were generating. She changed the war. And then we abandoned her to the peace." Labelle found Dorotea in Paris. She was 68 years old. She still taught music. She still had gray eyes. She agreed to an interview, but only on one condition. Her name would not be used. She would be filmed, and she would speak, but her face would be obscured. In the documentary, a woman sat at a piano with her back to the camera. Her hands moved across the keys with precision. She spoke about listening, about patterns, about the way a human being's involuntary gestures can carry meaning. "A man coughed," she said to the camera. "I heard it. I recognized it as intentional, so I listened for the pattern. I found it. I sent a letter, and the war ended differently than it would have. But I paid for listening, not because listening was wrong, but because listening requires you to act on what you hear. And action, in war, marks you as guilty either way. You are guilty of the deaths you fail to prevent, and you are guilty of the deaths you do prevent, because to prevent them, you must become complicit with the other side's logic." She played a piece by Satie. The music was simple. It was designed to be forgotten. It was designed to fade away, leaving no trace. "I am not a hero," she continued. "Heroes are simple. Heroes act for clear reasons and receive clear rewards. I acted because I could no longer live with my own voice in my ears. I could not hear the orders being typed into machines without trying to change them. So I did the only thing I could. I listened so carefully that I extracted meaning from the smallest sounds. And then I acted on that meaning. And I was punished. And I was right. And those two things are both true." She stopped playing. The music ended. The documentary was shown at film festivals. It won an award for innovation in historical storytelling, but no one knew the woman's name. She remained anonymous, as she had requested. The memorial in 1988, a memorial was erected in San Rafael, on the beach where Operation Dragoon had succeeded. It was a simple monument, stone and bronze. The plaque read, "In memory of those who died in the liberation of southern France, and in memory of those who lived because of an act of listening." August 15, 1944. 23,000 men landed. 1,940 died. 12,060 lived who would otherwise have perished. This monument stands for the visible victory, but the true victory was achieved by those who remained unseen. May we remember that silence is sometimes the loudest act of resistance. No names were inscribed. No individual heroes were named, because the monument was not for heroes. It was for people who had listened. It was for people who had chosen, in the machinery of war, to extract meaning from chaos and act on what they heard. Dorotea never visited it. She did not need to. She carried it within her, the weight of 12,060 lives, the memory of a man's cough, the knowledge that her listening had changed the world. She died in 1991 at the age of 77. She died in her apartment in Paris, listening to a recording of Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1. Her last words, according to the landlady who found her, were in Italian. Ascolta bene, senti tutto. Listen well, hear everything. She had asked that no funeral be held. She had asked that her body be cremated and her ashes scattered in the Mediterranean near Nice, the place where she had first heard the cough that changed the war. In her will, she left her papers to an archive. They included her original notebook with the 47 recordings of Aquila 7's transmissions. They included the draft of the letter before it was sent. They included notes on the pauses and the patterns and the way she had learned to extract meaning from the smallest sounds. Researchers would study them for decades, but they would never fully understand the simplicity of what she had done. She had listened. She had heard. She had acted, and the world had changed. Epilogue, 1997. The documentary was re-released on VHS for educational purposes. It became required viewing in French military academies, in history classes, in cryptography departments. A young woman watched it for the first time. She was studying semiotics at the University of Paris. The film moved her profoundly. At the end, she did something. She wrote a letter to the university's archive, asking if they had any more information about the woman in the documentary. The archivist, a man named Lucien Dufour, looked in his files. He found the materials Dorotea had bequeathed. He found her notebook. He found her letter. He called the young woman. He told her the story. He told her that the woman's name was Dorotea Morelli. He told her that Dorotea had died 6 years ago. He told her that Dorotea's final request had been that her story remain untold while she was alive, but could be told after her death. The young woman wrote her thesis on Dorotea. It was published. It became a book. The book changed how people understood the role of listening in war, in intelligence, in resistance. Dorotea Morelli was no longer anonymous, but she was no longer alive to know it. And perhaps that was how she would have wanted it, to have her listening finally heard, but only after she was no longer listening. The cough had become a legend. The woman who heard it had become a story. And the 12,060 lives that had been saved became a reminder. In war, the smallest act of attention can change the largest of outcomes.